Trust and respect are the cornerstones of all human relationships, especially marriage. But matrimony is built on standard agreement that those we care most about and love will behave in kind. A last betrayal can open the door to things in someone's small personal world, proving they may not be what they seem. The two elements of murder, the plan and the horrific execution, came together on October 10, 2003 in Cumberland County, Pennsylvania, forming the anatomy of the crime we'll discuss here today. In the year 2000, Sean Gaston, local movie theater projectionist, saw an ad in the local paper. It said an independent amateur film was being shot in Lancaster County. Actors and film crew were needed, no experience necessary. The film would take place on the Appalachian Trail, near an oil mining camp in central Pennsylvania. If he acted well enough, it could even take him up to the Hollywood Walk of Stars. Gaston had always been interested in cinema, and within minutes of seeing the ad, he was on the phone with the writer-director Blaine Norris. They discussed the idea of Through Hike, a Ghost Story. It would be a horror film where ghosts hunted Sean and other characters at night on the Appalachian Trail and systematically killed them. Blaine Mason Norris was not an outstanding figure in filmmaking. More precisely, he wasn't even a director. On weekdays from 9 to 5, Norris worked as a computer engineer at the Capital Blue Cross Insurance Company in Harrisburg. At age 24, he decided to make his dream come true, to become a director. In addition to the newspaper ad, he handed out invitations to colleagues, friends, and acquaintances to take part in the film. In the early 2000s, Blaine Norris watched a low-budget horror film that achieved incredible success thanks to an innovative marketing approach and the atmosphere of authentic, down-dirty documentary filming. That movie was The Blair Witch Project, which proved that the huge budget was not necessary to achieve success in Hollywood. The film was about three students who went hiking in the Black Hills of Maryland in 1994 to shoot a documentary about their hunt for a local legend known as the Blair Witch. All three disappeared without a trace, but their equipment and footage were found a year later. There was no film trailer, only missing posters for their characters. The story and the myth behind it were a fiction, but the tapes were so convincing that many people believed it was real. The blurring of the lines for a low-budget horror film garnered so much money. Screenwriters and cinematographers around the world rushed to create horror films in a similar pseudo-documentary style. Inspired by the Blair Witch Project, Norris decided to create his own film, and his new best friend, 28-year-old Brian Trimble, wanted to support him. Norris and Trimble worked together at the insurance company in the IT field. They had a lot in common, so Norris and Trimble quickly became friends. Both were happily married nerdy guys who loved movies, the world of fantasy, board games and video games. At work, the friends endlessly dreamed and discussed their project. Trimble was so confident in the success of their venture to make a film that after their initial backer pulled out of the project, he agreed to invest $18,000 into filming. So in 3 months the script was written and Blaine began auditioning actors. For Sean Gaston, Norris's passion for the genre more than compensated for his complete lack of directorial experience. And for the other novice actors who responded to the ad, Norris seemed less like a horror filmmaker and more like their biggest fan. He looked like his only real concern in life was to always have his beloved camera with him. The actors, in turn, had enthusiasm instead of portfolios. Basically, no one knew what they were doing. Here, the shots from auditions held by Blaine Norris. Aaron Lampert got the role only because she had the necessary quality for any respectable queen of horror. She could scream terribly and loudly. The only actress with experience filming was Robin Griggs, soap opera star of the series In Other World. She thought she had failed the audition, but Blaine hired her anyway. Robin's professional experience told her that this project would run into serious problems, starting with the script. In Robin's opinion, the story of 5 tourists pursued through the woods by a ghost was too run-of-the-mill and unoriginal in the form that Norris wrote it. Nevertheless, the novice director seemed convinced that his film would be able to match the stunning success of the well-known Blair Witch Project. Griggs had also been impressed by the auditions of the young actors, and so she found promise in the low-budget project. Gaston and his fellow novice actors didn't really believe that this cinematic filtration with the dark side would be a ticket to instant fame. They only hoped to experience a week of harmless fun out in nature and away from the daily routine of chores and work. The filming was supposed to take place on site along the Appalachian Trail in central Pennsylvania, where the whole group was going to go for 5 days. Norris invited his friend and creative companion Brian Trimble to be the cinematographer. In addition to working at the insurance company, Brian was an amateur cameraman who occasionally shot weddings, photo shoots, and other friendly events. An experienced cameraman was a great asset for an amateur film, especially since Brian agreed to shoot and was providing his own camera and equipment. Trimble also shot some test footage. When Brian Trimble and Randy Pack exchanged wedding vows on September 9, 2000, they knew they would really have to manage sickness and health together, as Brian had recently been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. It is an incurable disease with an unpredictable process. With proper treatment and care, Brian could live a long and full life. If he tried to ignore it, he could become incapacitated at any moment. Randy had decided and vowed that she would support Brian in all things, but when it came to the low-budget fan film, Randy had real concerns. The crew was going to go camping during the filming process, raising concerns for the delicate conditions of her husband's incurable disease. For the sake of his health, Randy forced her husband to forget about his movie filming fantasies and go back to computer repair. Brian didn't argue and backed out of the project. So, with Trimble's departure, Norris's hopes for getting 18,000s had also evaporated. For the director, it was clear to see that red flags were popping up everywhere. It was time to make an important decision. With no investor, no camera, no cameraman, the choice became clear. They would stop production. The equipment didn't work, the actors played badly, but Blaine was determined to make it work and just fix it in post. On the set there was always food for the actors, audio and video equipment. Blaine paid for everything that was needed without thinking about cost or expense. And no one wondered where he got the money. Blaine decided to fund his movie with loans, racking up huge debts, about 18,000 on his personal credit cards. It was a major expenditure for a lowly technician only earning about 60,000 a year. Oh well, he would get his money back with interest when the movie was a success, right? Money, or rather the lack of it, was not the director's only problem. Norris began telling actors that filming the movie was ruining his relationship with his wife, Wendy, and their newborn son. Supposedly, she was jealous of the time Blaine spent with the crew, suspecting him of having affairs with any or every actress on set. The crewmates found his statements strange, until one day Wendy appeared on the Appalachian Trail with their young son, Mason, in her arms and directly asked one of the actresses if she had been having an affair with her husband. With a strained marriage, poor funding, and bad acting, things couldn't get worse. But to top it all off, their soap opera big-name star Robin Griggs broke her arm. The only semi-famous actor's name disappeared from the credits of the horror film. Fortunately, another actress was waiting for her chance and quickly took Robin's place. Debut director Blaine Norris, now also the cameraman, pursued his merry company to hike up the Appalachian Trail and shoot this doomed slasher. But if Norris was having money troubles, he didn't show it to his actors and crew. During the 5 days of filming, he didn't talk about money or marriage, but chatted about his love for classic horror films like Halloween and A Nightmare on Elm Street. This is how the actors learned more and more about Norris's dark side. In his film The Ghost or Killer, the force of evil, as he called it, wins in the end. He even named the characters in his film in such a way that the first letters of their names spell out the word deaths. But as filming drew to a close, the actors grew fond of their nerdy, hopeful director, although they considered him more than a little weird. The cast and crew agreed he looked about 40 years old, but they were surprised to learn that Blaine was only 24 at the time. They also found his risque and vulgar jokes particularly unpleasant.
If Amber were to say to me, Blaine, you can have years of passionate sex with me if you run a mile with that watermelon, I would do it again.
The inexperienced actors found the filming process exhausting. They often had to shoot at night and got very little sleep. Blaine, on the other hand, was full of life and energy, always upbeat, active, and cheerful. He seemed simply obsessed in according cast and crew. When the footage for the horror film was shot and Norris returned to the routine of everyday life and the rigors of post-production, difficulties in his relationship with Wendy continued. Financial problems led to arguments around caring for their baby and his quickly changing priorities. The marriage came to an end. Soon after, his energy and communication to actors lost its momentum. A divorce from his wife, who naturally took their son from the growing debts and an unfulfilled passion project, it was clear that Hollywood was not in Blaine Norris's near future. He returned to working with computers along with Brian Trimble and continued to play Dungeons and Dragons with his would-be cameraman, doing their best to ignore the failure beneath their feet. No one could imagine that the real horror was yet to come, a scary true story with a plot filled with greed, deception, and a murderous ending. On January 10, Brian Trimble drove up the driveway of his and Randy's house after an almost hour-long drive from Lancaster, where he had dinner with his friends. When Brian entered the living room, it was early evening, around 9 o'clock. Randy should have already been home for an hour, but there were no lights in the windows. When Brian flipped the switch in the living room, he saw that everything had been turned upside down. It looked like they had been robbed, but where was Randy? Soon he found her. The man who was into horror movies, real horror suddenly erupted under his own roof. At 8:29 p.m., Brian called 911.
He's bleeding really bad.
Okay, and what's your name?
Brian?
What is it?
Brian?
Okay, what's your last name?
Trimble. B-R-I-M-B-L-E.
Okay, how old is she?
Oh, she's 27 or 28, I don't remember.
Okay, is she conscious?
I don't think so. I don't think so.
Okay, is she breathing?
No.
She's not?
No.
Okay. Okay, calm down. Okay, what happened there? Can you tell?
There was no doubt that 28-year-old Randy Trimble had been killed. Within minutes, the police were at the quiet suburban home at 221 Wood Street, completely still decked out with Christmas ornaments. Chip Dougherty was the lead detective assigned to the case and was the first to examine the body. The victim had been lying face down on the floor in a pool of blood. Blood-soaked hair was tangled and stuck to her face, so investigators at first couldn't even determine if the person before them was male or female. Later, it became known that an electric cable was wound around her neck, the cause of Randy's death, with multiple stab wounds, 27 of them to be precise. The rest of the crime scene was just as terrifying. From floor to ceiling, the entire place had been ransacked. To anyone else, it might have looked like a standard robbery turned deadly. However, Chip Dougherty, the seasoned detective, immediately realized that this was a stage event. The scene was just too chaotic, and there wasn't any real money to actually steal to begin with. Even the cleaning supplies in the bathroom were strewn about, which seemed meaningless. The previous Friday, January 10th, Randy, as usual, went to the Hershey Medical Center, where she worked as a speech therapist. After finishing work at 5, she went to her second job, where she cared for the elderly and people who had suffered strokes and lost their ability to speak. She was diligently saving money for the birth of the child as well as for the treatment of her husband Brian. The poor woman had no idea that death awaited her at home that evening. None of us know when it comes, but we all hope it won't come that soon. The winter of 2003 promised to be very cold. Nancy Chavez, Brian Trimble's mother-in-law, wanted to escape the low temperatures, went on a cruise with a friend. When she boarded the plane on January 5, she could never have imagined the nightmare that would await her in a few days. Randy's mother had to cut her cruise short and rushed home. Police cars were everywhere, guarding the crime scene, yellow police tape blocking access to the property. She frequented for dinners and visits with her only daughter. Being in utter shock, she had difficulty grasping what was actually going on and kept expecting her daughter to emerge from that house. Sadly, it was not to be. The brutal murder of Randy Trimble stunned the quiet community. A private funeral service was held for the family. Randy was covered in bruises and deep cuts, defensive wounds that covered her arms, face and neck, so the public farewell took place with a closed casket. She was buried in the same church where 3 years earlier she had pledged eternal love to her now widower husband, Brian Trimble. The wife brutally murdered. Even an armchair detective would solve such a case. The husband did it. However, Dougherty tried to be unbiased. The first thing to do was to talk to Brian and check out the alibi of the widowed man. The detective thought that in such a situation the person who found the body should have at least some of the victim's blood on them. Perhaps when Brian came home and saw his wife murdered in the garage, he could have grabbed her, hugged her, checked if she was alive or done something like that. But Brian stated that he did not touch his wife. According to Trimble, that evening he had dinner with an old friend at a well-established chain restaurant, which was a convenient 40 minutes drive from home. The next day, Dougherty spoke with Brian's friend and the waitresses at the restaurant. The grieving husband's story checked out. The coroner determined the time of death to be around 7:30, and he was surprisingly confident in his findings. It turned out Brian wasn't even close to the crime scene that night. There was another reason for Dougherty to cross Trimble's name off the suspect list: the words of Randy's mother. Nancy Chavez assured the police that her daughter and Brian's marriage was wonderful. Brian loved Randy and Randy loved Brian. Everything was perfect. There were no hints of trouble. In the terrible days after her daughter's murder, Nancy worried about and cared for her son-in-law, who had multiple sclerosis, hugged his friends, including his buddy, Blaine Norris, asking them to take care of Brian. Nancy loved her son-in-law like her own son. They were clearly both victims of this violent crime and loss of a loved one. Randy Lee Pack was born in Virginia on December 15, 1974, and was Nancy Chavez's only daughter. Being an only child and the first granddaughter, Randy was loved by all. She was always surrounded by adults and their care. As soon as Randy learned to speak, she was ready for almost anything to get the attention of those around her. She committed herself to dancing, recitals, singing lessons, games, and fun with neighbors, friends, and relatives alike. She had a spark that brought joy to people's lives, until the unthinkable happened. Of course, it wasn't easy for Nancy to raise her daughter alone. Money was always tight. Randy's grandmother and grandfather helped out, but Nancy was determined to cope and raise her daughter on her own. She got a job, worked part-time, and went to evening classes. Randy attended Trinity, a private Catholic high school in Camp Hill. That's where she turned into a very serious student. The girl excelled in her studies. She was a leader, participated in school plays, sang in the choir, and marched in the orchestra as a majorette. Randy's goal was to go to college and find a stable job. Nancy worked 2, sometimes 3 jobs to pay for her daughter's education at Bloomsburg University, where she studied speech therapy. As a student, Randy continued her love of music, learning to play the drums. Playing music boosted her self-esteem. She received a scholarship to study for a master's degree at Bloomsburg University, which she completed in 1999. Randy enjoyed doing research and participated in vigorous group discussions. She achieved her goal of being able to work with children and completed an internship at the Harshley Medical Center, where she later got a job. Like her mother, Randy began working to the 3 jobs during the summer while in college. Her goal was to create a financial foundation for her upcoming marriage. She bought her first house on her own at the age of 25. Randy was very proud of her accomplishments and what she had achieved in life. And soon her dream of finding her knight in shining armor came true. Randy met Brian Trimble. The charming boy was studying to be an engineer. Then he changed his mind and decided to become a teacher. Then he again changed his decision and wanted to join the Air Force. Unlike Randy, Brian had a definite dream or motivation, but this didn't scare the determined girl, nor did her husband's diagnosis. Brian really appreciated this and expressed his gratitude to his beloved in his wedding speech. After getting married, the young couple settled on Wood Street and got on building their dream life, one day at a time. She earned good money but also found a side job at the local nursing home to save money. She was striving to create a financial cushion in case Brian had to quit his job due to his illness. She was saving money for another dream. When they had a baby, there would be additional expenses. Randy wanted to get the most out of life and worked hard for it. It seemed she was doing great. A loving husband, stable job, her own house. Randy had no enemies, no one wishing her harm. no conflicts. There was the husband, who had an ironclad alibi at the crime scene and gave detectives no clues regarding other suspects. The state police, its units and forensics combed through everything at the crime scene, but they found nothing. Not hair, not fiber, no fingerprints. The detectives even had to appeal to the public through local media, but they yielded nothing either. Despite Trimble's alibi, lack of evidence and motive, Chief Dougherty was convinced that the victim's husband was the man they needed. First of all, he was a little confused in his testimony. As soon as the authorities met with Brian, he mentioned that he called 911 right after finding Randy's body and did not touch her. However, he later changed his testimony. This contradiction began to sow doubts in the minds of the police, and they decided to take a closer look at Brian. Of course, these discrepancies could be attributed to shock, until other circumstantial evidence began to emerge. One piece was provided by a young woman living across town. Being a keen observer, she was sure she had solved this case and rushed to share her guesses with the detectives. This was Norris and Trimble's office neighbor at work, Tracy Thompson. As soon as she heard the terrible news, she immediately thought that Brian had killed his wife. And here's why. Her colleague, Trimble, blissfully happy in his marriage, made a shocking statement before the holidays that he wanted to divorce and would announce it to his wife on Christmas Day. A few days later, he said all problems were behind them, that he and Randy had made up. And now, she was dead. Something about it all was wrong. Dougherty realized Brian was too physically weak to have done this. Along with his alibi across town, a bigger question began to form. Could he have hired someone to commit the murder? Soon, the police discovered a tantalizing clue on Trimble's computer, a link to a dark website that offered step-by-step guidance for a potential killer. Trimble sent the link to his friend, Blaine Norris, just 8 days before Randy Trimble's murder. Dougherty read the guide and the hair on the back of his neck stood on end. The instructions significantly matched that he saw at the murder scene. But Dougherty and the investigators needed more compelling evidence. They needed a confession. A few days after the murder, the investigators found a motive. Trimble had transferred thousands of dollars from his and Randy's savings account into his own and appeared eager to collect on his wife's $1,000 life insurance policy. The interrogations continued and Brian's behavior began to change. After Randy's funeral, her husband's parents ceased all communication with Randy's distraught mother, and Brian became very detached. He naturally moved out of the house on Wood Street, found an apartment closer to his mother, and took leave from work. Investigators didn't want to frighten Brian too much for fear that he would hire a lawyer. Detective Dougherty decided to break Trimble emotionally, playing simple mind games with him and attempt to appeal these emotions, if he indeed had any to begin with. Nearly every day the police would call him in a friendly manner, bombarding him with questions. For several months, officers would show up at his workplace and home without warning. These friendly visits were starting to annoy Brian. Whenever detectives came to his office, he wouldn't show up to work for several days afterwards. During one such unexpected home visit, Dougherty noticed the shiny new TV Trimble had just bought. "Wow," marveled the detective. "What a cool TV, Brian! You know, I'd like to buy one like that too, but my wife would never let me." To which Trimble grimly replied, "Yeah, my wife wouldn't have let me either." Brian hadn't only bought the TV but also a new gaming system, stereo equipment, and lavish trips to restaurants and entertainment events. He was behaving again like a carefree college student, starting flings with girls and not at all looking like a grieving widower. When relatives asked why he was spending money so freely, Brian replied, "Grieving costs a lot." Minor inconsistencies in his testimony, spending money like a sailor back on shore leave, questionable websites depicting violence. They didn't have enough for the district attorney yet, but maybe it would be enough to get Trimble to confess. The detective's strategy to pester Brian, throwing him off balance, seemed to be having a heavy influence. In May 2004, about 4 months after the murder, investigators felt their main suspect was on the verge of a breakdown. They invited him in for questioning at the station regarding new evidence in the case. When Detective Dougherty entered the small interrogation room, Brian was sitting to the left of second detective Les Freeling. The investigator asked, "You didn't kill your wife, did you?" Brian shook his head. "No. But you know who did it, right?" Freeling continued. And then Trimble confessed. It was Blaine. Blaine, the office nerd, the aspiring horror film director, a contract killer? The very idea seemed preposterous, not only to the friends and people working on the case, but also to the district attorney. All Dougherty had was speculation and ambiguity, yet the story kept coming back to the plot line with two mundane little men, Blaine Norris and Brian Trimble. Dougherty had no reason to believe the quiet computer guy who played video games, who also suffered from a serious illness, acted alone. To top it off, Trimble had all the characteristics of a known coward. He simply wouldn't have had the courage to do anything like that. These two, Norris and Trimble, were good friends, and perhaps even accomplices to crime that could have sprang from the minds of John Wayne Gacy, Ted Bundy, or Jeffrey Dahmer. Had this pair written their script for the perfect murder in a poor attempt to become real-life Hitchcock-storied killers? Trimble told investigators he was the one who planned the murder and was going to pay his buddy Norris a fee of around $2,000. That's about how much Norris owed after shooting his ill-fated film. Was that a motive for murder? Take a woman's life, the wife of his best friend, just to pay off debts and finish his film? After arresting Brian Trimble on May 8, 2003, the police focused closely on Blaine Norris. The director did not suspect that his old pal Trimble had ratted him out. Norris went to work and edited his horror film at home. Nevertheless, the police were in no hurry to arrest him. After all they had was Trimble's testimony, and they needed to corroborate every word Brian said as facts. They spoke with Blaine on the phone, and the very next day he hired a lawyer. Norris seemed determined to finish his masterpiece in the spring of 2004 and went bar hopping, trying to pick up as many girls as he could. According to friends, he complained that few were attracted to him. Blaine believed that reason for this unpopularity in bars was because he was old and fat. Perhaps it was because of these romantic failures that he became involved in swingers clubs and websites. But Blaine could already feel the noose tightening around him. Several months after the murder, Sean Gaston came to visit Norris in Harrisburg to help edit the footage. He was surprised by an impressive collection of swords, knives, and other medieval weaponry hidden in the director's studio apartment. Blaine told Sean he probably shouldn't bother editing the footage. The police were questioning him as Brian's friend, and they suspected him of the murder because he shot a horror film. Sean just laughed. Then why didn't they put Hollywood horror directors behind bars? Gaston wasn't the only one Blaine confided in about being the prime suspect in the murder. In his emails, he shared with other actors his speculations that the police considered him Randy's lover, despite only speaking to her for about 5 minutes in his entire life. He also wrote phrases like, "Remember me as you know me, not as the police say. Some of the happiest days were filming together with all of you. If you haven't seen Braveheart, please do. Every man dies, but not every man truly lives. have a beer for me," and concluded with, "That's a wrap." In letters to his friend, he bereaved widower Brian Trimble. Instead of offering comforting words, Blaine wrote, "Hey, how about contributing some money for my son Mason?" While drinking at a bar with a friend, Dan Bartesh, Blaine rested his head in his hands, recounting how he handed over his blood to authorities. Then followed a truck carrying a sample. Crazy thought flashed in his mind to veer off the road, where there was a steep mountain cliff to stage an accident. He kept driving and following that truck until he turned his car back. "But Blaine," slurred Dan, already quite intoxicated, "that truck was supposed to be your salvation. What was the point, buddy?" Dan believed that the blood sample would help exclude his friend from the suspects list. But Blaine knew differently. He was well aware of crime scene blood samples, and that's why he was scared. During a search of Norris' apartment, detectives discovered a collection of forensic science books detailing how to deceive forensic test results or what forensic experts look for. There was also a book titled Hitman, divulging the secrets of that profession. Additionally, the police found a stash of pistols, rifles, and hunting knives, although none matched the murder weapon. They even confiscated his movie and all the footage for investigation purposes. In Norris' car, officers found the most crucial evidence of all: a small receipt from the Kmart store in nearby Lancaster. It was proof that Blaine had purchased surgical gloves, work gloves, a black hoodie, and black pants just before the murder. That's right, he kept a receipt for tools of the trade for murder. Dougherty tracked the purchases down to the local store location and questioned the store manager. The detective needed to know if anything else was bought the day using the same credit card. Dougherty could barely stand still upon hearing the news. At that very Kmart, Blaine had bought a 15-centimeter meat-carving knife. This, of course, matched the forensic pathologist's results from the autopsy. The blade used to kill Nance Trimble was at least 15 centimeters long. It couldn't have been a mere coincidence. There was yet another problem. Blaine Norris had an alibi. His friend, Dan Bartesh, informed the police that he and that friend had seen Norris on the night of the murder between 7:15 and 7:30 in the evening near his apartment, precisely when the alleged killer of Randy Trimble was thought to be lurking. According to Dan, they stopped and talked for a few minutes before parting ways. In other words, Blaine couldn't have committed the crime. Or could he? Unfortunately for Norris, Dan remembered that moments after he and Blaine said goodbye, they and the other friend stopped at the gas station. Surveillance footage revealed that Dan purchased gas at the service station around 8:30 that night, not at 7:30 in the evening. He had confused the timing. Blaine left his apartment at 8:15, not 7:15. By then, he had already returned from the crime scene. His alibi had dissolved like smoke. Finally, the police and the district attorney believed they had all they needed for an arrest, which occurred at Norris' apartment in September 2003, another 4 months after Trimble was taken into custody. It was no longer a scene from a horror movie, but more like a bad sitcom about sad serial killers for hire. The officers climbed the high steps for the tiny porch of his apartment and knocked. Norris opened the door and saw officers in uniform. According to Dougherty, upon hearing the words, "You're under arrest," Blaine turned pale, almost as pale as the refrigerator nearby. The director literally lost consequences, collapsing right onto the floor in front of the astonished police. Blaine Norris was charged with first-degree murder in connection with Randy Trimble's death. Now he faced a different kind of horror, the death penalty. Norris insisted on his innocence, and a renowned lawyer handled his case. But the detectives were confident they could prove their case in court. The district attorney was well prepared. He had the confession of the murdered woman's husband that he hired Blaine as a hitman, and the prosecution was ready to seek the death penalty. Investigators who worked day and night in this case eagerly awaited their moment in court. And then the phone rang. Unexpectedly, at the 11th hour, Norris confessed to Randy Trimble's murder. In exchange for this admission, the death penalty was revoked. The trial never took place. For Detective Dougherty, it was a disappointment. But Blaine's lawyer knew that the defendant had struck the best deal possible. It was a beautiful, warm day, the beginning of spring, when Blaine Norris took a walk to Speedwell Lodge Lake in handcuffs and escorted by police officers. There he was supposed to show where he disposed of the knife. Norris cooperated, indicating the spot where he had thrown away the murder weapon. But unfortunately, the knife was never found. Life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, it was the same deal Brian Trimble had made with the district attorney a few months earlier. Yet, the unforgiven question remained: why? Randy and Brian initially led an amazingly happy life. They were respected in society. Their friends highly valued the couple's loyalty to each other and their work. But just a year after they tasted their wedding cake, problems arose in their marriage. Paradoxically, it was the planning for the future and attempts to protect themselves from everything that might come that ultimately created a rift in Randy and Brian's relationship. Throughout the summer and fall of 2002, the couple convinced everyone that they reconciled and everything was fine. They were looking optimistically towards the future. But the future was not meant to be. Randy had tried to remain practical in her control and organization of their respective lives, including her husband's treatment, while Brian hated how the illness affected his daily life. He tried to escape from reality, and Randy's excessive care had only suffocated and irritated him. This was compounded by arguments about finances. Trimble didn't spend money. He couldn't. His thrifty wife, who had advised him to abandon Blaine's stupid movie, had also held him back from frivolous purchases. Randy worked multiple jobs, saved money, made plans. Brian worked one job and plotted ways to get rich quick and dream of a better life without taking real action. She earned more than her husband, and ultimately Brian began playing by her rules, at least outwardly. Brian didn't want friends to know that all their finances were controlled by his wife. It got so bad that he even had to borrow money for lunch on more than one occasion. If he needed to withdraw cash from the ATM, Trimble first called his wife for permission. He simply pretended that this arrangement suited him and that they had a good marriage. They kept the picture going that they were in a perfect marriage. When Detective Dougherty asked Brian Trimble this crucial question a few moments after his confession, he replied, "She controlled me, and I couldn't make her feel the pain of divorce. I couldn't make her family go through the pain, because I still love her very much." It sends chills down your spine. Turns out Brian Trimble couldn't orchestrate his wife's murder, but heaven forbid he asked for divorce. In his book The Doors of Perception, Aldous Huxley compared the human brain to a reducing valve. He reckoned that if the doors of perception to our world were always open, each thing would appear in infinite variations. However, humans are confined within themselves and our consequences is limited only to our perceptions. Ideas, memories, and desires, rejecting everything else. Unerrored consequences prevents the flood of images and impressions from overwhelming us and driving us insane, but can become a habit, a small cave, a shell that seems to be the entire existing world. Blaine and Brian spent many hours together at work, knowing each other's problems, each trapped in their own. Blaine needed just a little money, a tiny amount, for his horror creation to be fulfilled. Brian struggled with his relationship, with his domineering wife lacking the courage to divorce her. He often complained to his friend about Randy, and finally, in jest, Blaine said, "So, why don't you just kill her?" Later, Norris remarked that there was some truth in his joke. Blaine was fed up with the relationships in which he felt utterly powerless and couldn't break free. So he asked his friend, "What's on your mind?" And then these two began to devise a plan, developing it over many months and eventually carried it out. They turned to what they knew best, movies, which were also an integral part of their world. The friends watched Murder by Numbers, starring Sandra Bullock. It's a story about two young people who kill for thrills and try not to leave traces of their crime. They continued gathering ideas from the movies, ultimately creating their own script. Trimble had health and financial issues, but his selfishness gave him a narrow view of the situation and a theory that his wife's death would bring him more money and release her from the responsibility of caring for him when disease would eventually ravage his body. Later, Nancy's mother recalled that when the couple argued, Brian would start trembling in silent rage, blushing and clenching his fists silently. His gaze became terrifying and menacing. Then he would return to himself as if nothing had happened. This was the most dangerous, demonic type of rage, one that accumulates, ready to burst out like a hurricane, destroying everything in its path. Both Trimble and Norris could have backed out of their plan at any moment during the months of planning and discussion, but they didn't. They followed through with more devotion and skill than they had for their movie. After lunch for January 10th, when Randy was at work, the friends met at the Trimble's house, causing a commotion and taking some items to make it look like a robbery. Brian went to a pre-arranged meeting in Lancaster to secure his alibi, while Blaine stayed in the garage waiting for Randy to return home. He knew a lot about forensics from movies and books, so he acquired everything necessary not to leave any evidence behind. He wore a protective black suit over his own clothes. When his victim returned home, parked the car in the garage and got out, he attacked her, attempted to strangle her, but Randy's death was not quick. The girl managed to place her hand between the wire and her neck. Blaine didn't expect such resistance. He slammed her head on the concrete garage floor, but Randy didn't die. She begged him to stop, offered to take valuables and money. That's when Blaine moved to Plan B, inflicting numerous stab wounds on Randy. Even a detective within 30 years of experience felt a chill running down his spine when Norris calmly recounted how his victim began to pray, realizing she was dying. Blaine detailed the horrific aspects of his crime as if it were nothing. He spoke of how he had to stab and stab, strangle and strangle, and it was nothing like on TV. Even Brian himself was shocked by Blaine's cruelty. Several days after the murder, Norris attempted to tell Trimble how it all went, but Trimble couldn't bear to hear the gruesome details. Suddenly, he realized that his friend had embodied his most genuine horror movie fantasy. Deep down, Blaine enjoyed the role of a hired killer. Dougherty remained convinced that Norris was an unsuccessful serial killer, and if they hadn't caught him, he probably would have killed again, especially now that he had acquired the taste for it. By incarcerating Norris, the detectives possibly saved someone from a horrific fate. However, these are just speculations. Blaine himself never explained the reasons for Randy Trimble's murder. Acquaintances believe Norris considered Randy guilty of causing her husband to withdraw from involvement in the film. He desperately needed $18,000 to cover credit card debts accumulated during the film's shooting. According to Trimble, he promised to pay Norris $20,000 as a fee for committing the crime. It's easy to calculate how much profit he made from the murder. Brian, who had spent the family's savings carefully accumulated by his wife, had only $4 left out of $25,000 at the time of his arrest. Both Blaine Norris and Brian Trimble were sentenced to life imprisonment for Randy's murder. God left humans only 10 commandments, one of which states, "Thou shalt not kill." Yet Blaine Norris couldn't even abide by that. He believed that God had forgiven him for the repentance. Yet in the months following the murder, he showed no remorse for what he had done. He even wrote an anonymous letter to the police, signed as the Patrolman, the killer of Randy Trimble. In it, he stated that Trimble was innocent, that rural cops were barking up the wrong tree, and boasted that the foolish police would never find him. After Dougherty's arrest, he reminded Norris of this letter. "So, Blaine, he said the rural cops would never catch up to you?" He had no response. It's unknown why Blaine signed as the patrolman, but there's one clue. It seems Norris was seeking a new job. During a search, detectives found several resumes in his desk. According to one of them, Blaine was applying for a position in the Pennsylvania State Police. For many years following that sentencing, Brian unsuccessfully tried to appeal it. Since he pleaded guilty, he cannot file an appeal. But both Brian and Blaine still remain in separate Pennsylvania correctional facilities. Sometimes the most disturbing parts of the horror movie happen off-screen. The theme of this real story was greed, and the monsters in their culmination pounced on the only person close to them, although Randy Trimble had never signed up to play the role of the horror star. Perhaps the failed director Blaine Norris distorted the notion. Art is eternal, but life is short. So he fell off the tightrope stretched over the abyss of his problems, and they buried him beneath them. After the senseless and tragic events that took Randy Trimble's life, her mother, Nancy Chavez, decided to create something positive out of this nightmare. She founded a fund to raise money for victims of domestic violence called Randy's Angel House. She dedicated herself to a personal campaign to communicate with young women, persuading them to ask themselves a single question: do they truly know the man they are with and profess to love? Now Nancy consoles herself with the little that remains of Randy, including her wedding photographs, her daughter smiling peacefully while her killers look on and smile too. The film Through Hike, a Ghost Story, directed by Blaine Norris, is now collecting dust in the basements of the East Pennsboro Police Department.